to the Mississippi River. And then every year, the population in Florida, there's about 150 panthers in the southwest part of the state. Every year, 25 get hit on the roads. Every single year. If we had 150 cats spread out across the East Coast, we should be seeing 25 killed every year. Yes, some of them might go missing, but not all of them. All right? Especially in places where we have much higher road densities, like coastal New England. We get a lot of reports along coastal New England, but we've got one roadkill in New England. But cats have been out there for the last 50 or 60 years. What are they? Carrie got a call one day. Carrie lives in northwestern Pennsylvania. The guy said, "Hey, come on over to my house. I got a cougar in my backyard." And Carrie got there, and this is what he had: a 6-month-old pet cougar. Another 6 months, that cat would be a lot bigger and a lot harder to handle. So we now know that for the last 50 or 60 years, these guys have either been getting out or people let them go. Right? Cats that are bred for the exotic pet trade are bred from Latin American stock. They're smaller, they have shorter fur, creamy coats. Half of our DNA evidence from eastern Canada, about a dozen confirmations, half of them are Latin American cats. So that's what's been out there on the East Coast for the last 50 or 60 years, these former pets. Until this guy. June 5th, 2011, Greenwich, Connecticut. The only photograph ever taken of a living wild mountain lion on the East Coast north of Florida. The gentleman who took this happened to be the son of a woman who volunteers at the Wolf Conservation Center in southern New York State, where I've done this talk a couple of times. He took it on a Sunday evening, or Sunday at dusk. They sent it to me Wednesday morning of that week. I blew it up. I couldn't tell if that was his tail or his trailing leg. I sent it to a couple of our computer guys, but by that afternoon, the Connecticut DEP had confirmed this as a mountain lion. International headline news. Mountain lion in Connecticut. 2 nights later, I happened to do this talk in Connecticut. Needless to say, I have my biggest audience. And where I suggested, God forbid, that if this cat gets hit, it's going to turn out to be somebody's pet. Jason Hawley, one of the Connecticut DEP biologists, happened to be there that night. He introduced himself afterwards. We had a nice chat. We went home. And 4 hours later, he was hit on the Merritt Parkway, 35 miles east of Greenwich. So when I got news that weekend, I called Jason and I said, if you guys need help with your necropsy to try to figure out where he came from, we're there for you. John Landre, our vice president, has written a couple of papers about how to identify mountain lions, looking at their teeth and their gums, and he helped them determine he was about 3 years old. They also asked us to recommend a lab to do the DNA analysis, and we suggested a lab out in Missoula, Montana, which has the biggest cougar database in North America. Not because we thought this was going to be a wildcat, but because we thought they might have a line on some of these breeding stocks. But when the evidence came in, as you might have learned, his DNA traced him to the Black Hills. All right. In fact, he had left evidence all across the country. All right. He was first spotted on a police dash cam outside of St. Paul. He made it through Minneapolis, through eastern Minnesota, into Wisconsin, where it was tracked by Wisconsin DNR for 6 months. And they lost him in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He was the first mountain lion photographed in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Disappears for a year. One night, a woman's doing her dishes in Lake George, New York State, southern Adirondacks. Mountain lion goes through the backyard. She said, "Hey, honey, a mountain lion just went through the backyard." And he said, "Nah, probably a bobcat." He was a retired ranger from the DEC. But he went out the next morning with a biologist from the DEC. They picked up his tracks. They knew that was no bobcat. They picked up some of his fur. They sent his fur to Melanie Culver in Arizona, who didn't get back to them for months. By that time, the news from Connecticut came in, so they sent the remaining sample to the lab in Montana, and it verified that this was the same cat that was killed in Connecticut. So it's a remarkable story. As far as we know, it's the longest dispersal of any terrestrial animal, maybe in world history. He went at least 2,000 miles. Why did he go 2,000 miles?
Looking for a mate.
Exactly. So if he had found a female anywhere along that route, he would have stopped and mated with her and settled in to defend his territory. He would have never gotten to Connecticut, which is the ultimate evidence that there's no breeding going on out here. John Landry has said that if a male is within 300 miles of a female and he will find her. Right? So if we had any females out there, he would have found her. So one of the things we've been doing, because when you look at that, think about that map from the Cougar Network earlier with all those dots in the Midwest, it looks like you have a lot of cats out there. Okay, but we're trying to hone that down to see how many there actually are. And what we started doing was looking at the mortalities. How many get killed outside of these source colonies every year? We've been tracking that for the last 17 years. 2011 was the biggest year. 16. 15 males, 1 unknown, and 1 female. She came from the Black Hills. She was caught in Tulsa. Now she's in a zoo in Kansas. She can't breed from a zoo in Kansas. Okay, so anyone who suggests that they're going to recolonize the Midwest and the East Coast on their own aren't looking deep enough at the data. All right, and part of why these numbers have been going down since 2011 because they're hammering this population in the Black Hills. They began hunting them in 2005. Okay, the number of cats taken out each year up until 2011, 2012, which was the most, 73 out of what we think is a population of 150. Okay, then they haven't been able to hit anywhere near that number for the last 6 years. The quota is 60. They got 30 this year. So the number of dispersers moving east is going down. So there's a number of potential cats to recolonize is going down. From 2000 to 2005, these are the mortalities out here in the Midwest. Okay, again, they're coming from primarily the Black Hills. Watch what happens when they start hunting them in 2005, 2006. 2006, 2011, notice the difference. Notice where they're getting killed. It's open season outside those source colonies. They're getting killed much closer to where they're coming out of, which means you have fewer cats coming out here. 2011 to 2016, fewer cats still. Okay, so again, the potential for the recolonization is going down. But good news, first confirmation of a female in Missouri last year. Female was confirmed in Tennessee 2 years ago. We do not know if they are still alive. We do not have evidence of breeding yet, but we are keeping our fingers crossed. Florida, these guys have been hemmed in down here because the females don't cross the Caloosahatchee River. Last year, a first female crossed the Caloosahatchee River. She's had kittens. And so potentially, they're going to start moving up into, we're hoping, through Central Florida. The habitat's not good for them there, but getting into northern Florida within a couple of years. Okay, so that's the picture on the ground. Again, this is your closest breeding population to Brunswick, Maine, the Niobrara River Valley. So for the last 18 years, this is what we've been up to. Reviewing photographs. We spent thousands of hours in the field following up reports. We've done a decade of cam surveys in 7 states. We're not seeing any evidence. We have that one picture. And we're also not getting incidental evidence on the East Coast. And when we do, you see what happens. That cat that came from Connecticut left evidence all over the place. And not just us are looking. The Smithsonian has done a big camera survey in Virginia along the Appalachian Trail with 500 cameras, no evidence. Big carnivore study in the Adirondacks, 5 different agencies, no evidence of mountain lions there. So by 2008, we determined what we didn't know back in 1999 when we were formed, and that was that there are no breeding populations of mountain lions on the East Coast. So what do? They're not here, let's bring them back. So we changed our name from the Eastern Cougar Foundation to the Cougar Rewilding Foundation, and rewilding simply means restoring native species to their native habitat. And this is their native eastern habitat. I have to qualify this a little bit because from the bounty records in Maine, there are none except for, well, they're all in the southwestern part of the state. Okay, because that's where the deer were. Historically, the rest of the state was moose and caribou habitat. Right? You didn't have deer up there. So that's, you don't tend to see mountain lions where you've got some of those bigger ungulates. And we often hear from folks that, or sometimes hear from folks that we can't have them on the East Coast because there's too many people and too much development. But again, look at California. 58 million people, 5,000 cougars, an area and a population comparable to Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia combined. So if they can make it in California, they can certainly make it here because we have way more deer and way more cover. You may have read about this guy, P22, the most famous mountain lion in the world, living in Griffith Park, right in the middle of Los Angeles. He's been there for 5 years. He came out of the Santa Monica Mountains, crossed a couple of big highways, where he has his own private hunting, surf, fiefdom, and whatever. He's been a wonderful ambassador for us because he's behaved himself perfectly. And Los Angeles loves this cat. They're really in love with him. These two plopped themselves down. I don't know if you can see. I'm sorry, this is trying to fade. These two came down to the San Gabriel Mountains. They plopped themselves down on someone's front lawn. This is a mom and her big cub. They called the police. The police showed up, but they didn't draw their guns. They didn't call for backup. They didn't take them out in a hail of gunfire. What'd they do? They turned on their sirens and they shooed them away. Why? Because people in LA have gotten used to living with mountain lions the same way that people in New Jersey have gotten used to living with black bears. Okay? They're used to them by now. They love them. All right? And again, we have very few incidents in the LA area. So we can learn to live with anything. Last couple of years, I've gone out to visit my uncle in San Francisco, and I spend a week and a half going up and down the Bay Area looking at mountain lion habitat. This is Pacifica. This is 5 miles south of the San Francisco line. North of here, it is completely built out. This is the last place, or the first place, where you have any amount of open space. This is San Pedro Park outside of Pacifica, posted mountain lion habitat. People taking their morning walks where the mountain lions are. This is Los Gatos, an hour down the peninsula on the edge of Silicon Valley, next to San Jose. I spent a day in the field with the UC Santa Cruz Puma Project. We were tracking a female to her den. Her den was a quarter mile from this development in Los Gatos and 100 yards from this access road that hundreds of people every day were using. Walkers, bikers, people taking their kids out. We did find her den. Unfortunately, she had not made a kill in over a week, so her kittens had starved. She was a young mom. This was the second litter she had lost. And hunting for them in that area is harder. They make more kills and let them go more often because you have not a lot of competition. So she has reared them successfully since then. This is Berkeley. This is Oakland. This is Grizzly Boulevard up on the ridge east of those cities. A couple of big parks up there, Tilden Park, Redwood Canyon Park. People walking their lapdogs and walking their toddlers in posted mountain lion habitat. There have been 2 incidents, 7.5 million people in the Bay Area over the last 100 years. Okay, so cougars can make it. They're almost as adaptable as coyotes. Okay, they can make it just about any place. But when we talk about bringing them to the East Coast, we don't want to start them in New Jersey. We want to start them in the places with the least potential for conflict. Places like the Adirondacks, the White Mountains, the Catskills, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. 20 years ago, 19 Texas cougars were reintroduced as a test release to southern Georgia to see if they can make it in an eastern habitat, eastern landscape. They were out there for 2 years. A couple got hit, a couple got shot, but we know they can make it in eastern landscapes. They caught them at the end of that study and took them back to Texas. John Landry, our vice president, done a habitat analysis for Adirondack Park, which is 3 times the size of Yellowstone. And John figured that there's enough habitat and enough deer to support 350 mountain lions. Why do we want to bring them back? This is the most important part. We're almost done, so hang with me here. It's an ecological imperative. Cougars, wolves, grizzlies are what are called keystone species. These big predators require more habitat than everything else. When you protect habitat for them, you protect habitat for all the other critters under their umbrella. And we also now know that cougars guard and shepherd ecosystems. What do I mean by that? A border collie will help a sheep herder move a herd of sheep from one pasture to another to allow that first pasture to regrow. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, they began to have the same effect on elk as a border collie does on sheep, but they were doing it just by being there. Just by their presence changed the way the elk were browsing. They stopped acting like cattle. Because with the wolves on the landscape, they had to start looking over their shoulders, right? Keep moving while they're eating, not stopping to graze. When that happened, vegetation that hadn't grown in Yellowstone since the wolves were exterminated in the 1920s started to grow back. Cottonwoods, aspen, willow. This is a creek before the wolves. This is that same creek 5 years later. These willows are growing back because this is a potential ambush site. An elk doesn't want to get caught dead there. When the willows came back, beaver came back, fish came back, frogs came back, birds and butterflies came back. Your biodiversity in Yellowstone began to explode, not because wolves were killing so many elk, but because they were changing the way the elk browsed. There's a video on YouTube called How Wolves Change Rivers. Check it out. It's been seen by millions. John Landry, kind of like Forrest Gump, first biologist on the ground, watching these guys, watching the elk change in response to the wolves being there. He wrote the first paper on it. It's groundbreaking research, probably the most important development in conservation biology in the last 25 years. Other biologists went to see if they could find this happening other places. They went down to Zion National Park in southwestern Utah, where they found the main tourist canyon, Zion Canyon, overrun by mule deer. But in another canyon 9 miles east called North Canyon, where very few people went, which was more remote, they found the entire ecosystem intact. And the only difference they could find between Zion Canyon and North Canyon was that there were cougars in North Canyon, but none in Zion Canyon. So cougars were having the same effect on mule deer as the elk were, as the wolves were back in Yellowstone on the elk. They went to Yosemite, found the same results. Olympic National Park got the same results. And anywhere you've got enough of these big predators moving around these prey species. Okay, back in Montana, we saw mule deer herds as big as any whitetail herds I've seen here on the East Coast. But we were also finding this, sapling regeneration. Try finding this in a deciduous forest on the East Coast now. It's not happening. But it's happening there because, in this retired utility corridor, because you've got the grizzlies and the wolves and the cougars moving around the elk and the mule deer, acting like deer shepherds. What does this mean for the East Coast? In Cades Cove, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, 46 species of wildflower in 1970 were gone by 2004, all of them relished by white-tailed deer. That's a quote from a book called Where the Wild Things Were, which traces ecology studies over the last 100 years, culminating in the research in Yellowstone and Zion. When you lose your big predators, ecosystems collapse. Back in the Gunks, that's my hound Tonka, and every winter when that creek freezes over in the Clove Valley where I've had a dozen cougar reports, I go out to see if I can find some sign. I found one set of one set of cat tracks in there over the last 10 years, and those are bobcat prints. The rest of the tracks in here, besides ours, are deer and coyote and fox. This is behind the beaver dam. There's the beaver lodge. You can see the beaver were active in the winter. And every March when the creek melts out, I go out there to watch, sorry this is so dark, it's lighter in some conditions, but I go out there to watch the woodcocks do their spectacular spring mating ritual. So I was out there at dusk one night, standing on the edge of the creek, and a female beaver came down the creek, and she's there in the middle, believe it or not. And then there's ripples from the kit out here. Right, and then I moved over into the fields to watch the woodcocks do their thing. And ducks were flying by, and geese were honking in the wetland behind me, and 2 great blue herons flew over, and 3 great horned owls flew by, and the coyotes started yipping. It was like the Serengeti Plain. Okay, we get 500,000 visitors to the Gunks every single year, and I've seen maybe 6 people in these fields during the last 10 years. This is like my private slice of heaven on earth. This is my favorite place in the world. And it's dying. This is an invasive species called Japanese stiltgrass. This is behind my old house in Rosendale. This stuff just came right down the canal, right up over the banks, and right into the understory in one season. How does it do that? It does that because the deer have cleared out everything else, and deer don't eat Japanese stiltgrass, which is why we're losing ground nesting habitat in our deciduous forests on the East Coast. 100 yards past the stiltgrass is a native plant called hay-scented fern. It's native, but it starts to act like an invasive species because deer don't eat it. So as these trees begin to age and die and collapse, there is nothing there to replace them but this stuff. So as if we have anything else to worry about, folks, this is what's happening to our forests that have regenerated over the last 100 years on the East Coast. They're no longer regenerating. How do these plants start? They begin in degraded areas like road shoulders and parking lots. This is a plant called white snakeroot. It's native, but it's also toxic to deer. I did a survey of all the climbing crags in the Gunks a couple of years ago, and I found that plant popping up all over the cliffs. The first place I found it was in the West Traps parking lot where climbers congregate in the morning. So climbers are picking it up on their shoes and their clothing and their gear and introducing it to the cliffs. This is a pitch pine. Pitch pines are common on Cape Cod and Long Island and the Jersey Pine Barrens, but they're rare on mountaintops. The Gunks are one of only 6 places in the world where you see pitch pines on top of a mountain. So potentially these plants are going to start crowding out our pitch pines. The Biodiversity Partnership that manages the ridge has been trying to knock back the deer herd with a grant from the DEC in New York State, and it's not working because, believe it or not, we can't recruit enough hunters to take out 100 deer a year, 3 years in a row, to knock back the herd to see some regeneration here. Okay? But if we had 6 cougars roaming the ridge, and this is an area about the same size as the Santa Monica Mountains in northwest Los Angeles, we'd be seeing regeneration in these forests the same way we're seeing regeneration in Yellowstone and Zion and Yosemite and any place where you got enough of these big predators moving around these prey species. So that's the ecological reason for bringing them back. Of course, we have economic reasons as well. Southwestern Florida, Panther Wildlife Refuge, little refuge down there, attracts 8,000 visitors a year, not to see the cats because they don't see them, but they do tours, bike tours and hiking tours to look for their sign. Attracts 8,000 visitors and produces $7 million a year, and there's only 2 panthers on that property. Reintroduced elk to Winslow, Pennsylvania, attracts 200,000 visitors a year. They also have some limited hunting. Produces nearly $66 million in wildlife watching. Eastern North Carolina, reintroduced red wolves. Attracts 25,000 families a year to that part of Carolina. It has boosted tourism by 19% and generates $37 million a year in wildlife watching tourism. And of course, Yellowstone National Park, the wildlife watching capital of the Western Hemisphere. 1.8 million of the 3 million or so visitors who come to Yellowstone each year come to see the wildlife. They come to the Lamar Valley to see the wolves and the elk and their ancient dance together. And they also come to see the bison, of course. So John and I worked up the numbers and wrote a paper about restoring not just mountain lions to the Adirondacks, but we think you should bring back the whole ecosystem. There's no reason Adirondack Park, which again is 3 times the size of Yellowstone, shouldn't have the whole ecosystem there. No reason there shouldn't be elk and bison. Yes, they were on the East Coast originally, wolves and pumas. And we suggested that wildlife watching, by bringing those guys back, would produce about at least 300,000 new visitors a year to the Adirondack, which see between 7 and 9 million people a year. It would produce nearly 3,000 jobs and more than $500 million in wildlife watching revenue. New York State is the biggest wildlife watching state in terms of revenue in the country. 20% of all wildlife watching revenue in the United States is produced in New York State. Compare that to a couple of other revenue generators. There's a resort called Big Tupper Lake, which is supposed to generate about $22 million a year. Deer hunting in the Adirondacks currently produces about $49 million a year. And the DEC and other people have looked at what happens when you invest $1 in wildlife. You get a return of $7 to $21, which is as good as an investment as you can find for anything. Right? So these numbers, we think, are very conservative. All right. So cougars were once native to the East Coast. Whoops. They're part of our natural heritage. We know they're vital for the functioning of ecosystems. We know that bringing them back could produce a lot of, or help the economy in certain places. We know that people like having them out west. They know we can live with them. And we also know from public attitude surveys that not only do people want to see them come back on their own, they want to see them reintroduced to the right places on the East Coast. So that's why we're called the Cougar Rewilding Foundation. And that's why we're working to restore cougars to all of their former range. And thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
And of course, if you want to read about the cat that was killed in Connecticut and his great trek, Heart of a Lion came out about a year ago. And Will, who wrote the book, is going to be joining us here in Vermont, or here in Maine in the end of June. And Nicole, would you like to tell us about this? Nicole Olivier is, well, you can just talk about yourself.
Hi, I'm Nicole Olivier. I live in Damascata, and I have a literary series, author event series called Book Speak. And on June 28th, we will be hosting Will Stoltenberg, who wrote The Heart of a Lion, Chris Betts, John Davis, who is the president of the...
He's one of the founders of the Wildlands Project.
The Wildlands Project.
And he's also one of our directors.
Right, on the board of directors. As well as Peter McKinley, who is the vice president of the DRA, the Damascata River Association. And he is a biologist, and then we will have John Davis will be the moderator. And the really exciting thing about this is that it was wonderful to have Chris come here and introduce you to this. And how many of you are just ordinary people, not conservationists, like not with conservation groups like Ed? And raise your hand for those of you who just came because you were really interested. Okay, that's wonderful. And I'm just hoping that that your interest will generate more interest for our big forum there, which will be a very good-sized group, and there'll be tickets by reservation, and we'll be starting to advertise it soon, and we're being sponsored by 5 different conservation groups, including the Damascata River Association, and they've donated the Darrow's Barn, which is in Round Top Farm. Okay, so it'll be held there, and it's going to be a fantastic event, and I'm so excited and so grateful to Chris for initiating this, starting this introduction. So thank you so much, and be watching for publicity on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. So questions? Yes.
Chris, I've been here for 17 years. I organized a rally for wolves in D.C. In September 2013. I'm trying to be pretty active and do my part to help wildlife. to me, this state is, with wildlife policy, it's just idiotic. It's kind of, if Governor LePage was setting wildlife policy, this is the kind of anti-wildlife policy we have. I don't see how we change. I'm not being pessimistic, don't get me wrong. I don't see in a state like Maine, with kind of the lock that the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, these guys have a lock on stupid. You can educate them and tell them that it's better for the whole universe, their children will be healthier, the water will be cleaner, the air will flow, and they'll say, go F yourself. How do you overcome stupid? Because this is a state of stupid people. There's a lot of wonderful people, that's why we're here. But there's so many stupid people, and stupid people with wildlife policy have the power in this state. How do you overcome it? Tomorrow, by the way, the state is having a hearing on a right to hunt, those things that keep coming up. So we can't have a wildlife referendum where you have good-hearted, intelligent people guided by science and ethics having a voice. Now, that may not pass, but if it does, then it makes everything harder. This is one of the stupid states in the country, along with Wisconsin and Idaho. How do you overcome stupid?
There are young folks who are in ecology programs, undergraduate programs and graduate programs now, who are getting backgrounds in the science, more and more, who weren't raised in the culture that produces what you're talking about. So they will begin to transform this from the inside, because they're going to get hired, and they're getting hired by the state agencies. A lot more women are coming out of these programs and are moving into the state agencies. One of our interns did a program with us when she was an undergrad at Michigan State. She went on for a graduate degree in Illinois at Carbondale, did a public attitude survey in Illinois on what it would take to bring back wolves and cougars and black bears to Illinois. Did a habitat study for them. Got a good job in Missouri briefly, and then she got on the Mexican wolf recovery team. She's the leader of the recovery team now. Okay, so that's one way. Right. Funding certainly has to change because all state agencies are funded primarily, 2/3 of their funding comes from hunting and fishing licenses. And please understand that I hunt and I fish. Okay, so I am not I'm not biased against hunters and fishermen, certainly. And half of our board of directors hunts, and our founder is a houndsman. So so we are by no means anti-hunting. But that's where most of the funding comes from. And the other third of it comes from taxes on gear. All right, so unless that gets changed, and a number of ways have been floated to do it, but the outdoor industry, the smart people, Patagonia and REI and North Face, refused to take that excise tax 17 years ago when it was proposed, to fund all the other non-game species that need protection. So even the smart people are a problem. All right? So we have to educate them as well, somehow. All right? And I just spent 3 years working with the DEC in New York State on their state wildlife action plans for wolves and mountain lions. All right? They were very cautious about having wolf and mountain lion advocates in the room with them, but we had a really good experience. It didn't get wolves and mountain lions on the list of state wildlife action plans for New York State, but it did get us in the loop and talking to not just the DEC, not just the biologists and the administrators there, but also face-to-face with hunters and trappers and fishermen and turkey hunters, and all in the same room, in a way that nothing else I have ever done in this field got us together working on that stuff. So that's another way. So there are And this is one way to do it too. So is it going to happen quickly? No, but we have to keep plugging away at it. So those are just some of the ways I can have off the top of my head. So
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
I left out Mark McCullough.
Go ahead.
I just forgot to mention that he just came on to the panel. So his name is Mark McCullough, and he is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And we're anticipating a really interesting dialogue between him as a representative of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and how he did all his research trying to determine the number of cougars who have been living in Maine, just like what Chris was talking about, and how, because of their incredible elusiveness and lack of evidence, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife decided that they were not going to be able to continue to afford to keep them on the endangered species list, and so they are considering delisting the cougar and then putting the money towards the lynx. And so the conversation will be really interesting. There are decided reasons for why they're doing that we really want to learn more about. And he's a highly respected marine biologist and conservationist himself, so I think it will make a very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Nicole.
Sorry.
It's okay. Hi.
Chris, I appreciate your comment there a moment ago around the sportsman side of things. And correct me if I'm wrong, but 1930s was kind of the market hunting era. And if it wasn't for the houndsmen, we probably wouldn't have mountain lions.
Absolutely.
So
yep.
I think it's important to recognize that sportsmen, hunters, I noticed you use the word sport hunter, which I'm curious why that terminology.
They're not subsistence hunters. They're not hunting them for food.
Sport hunter?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So back to the whole Pittman-Robinson Act, which is the funding you're talking about that comes from sporting goods. I actually work for an outdoor apparel company. I can tell you I would love to see the outdoor industry join that. I think it's important that if you have a voice in where you vote your dollars, talk to those companies, make it known. I think the outdoor industry needs that. I also think the birding industry could step up. I'm curious where your numbers come from for the amount of dollars for recreation. You had 200 and some odd million.
We used the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service study on outdoor recreation, on hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching that comes out every 5 years. A new one should be coming out. This is the numbers from 2011. So we looked at those areas. We looked at the areas that I outlined and a couple of other places. We looked at the visitation at, in say Yellowstone and Pennsylvania, and what was already happening in the Adirondacks. And so we kind of worked out. We have a paper that's online if you want to look at our website. It's in one of our newsletters. It's called, what is it called? It's called Wildlife Investment Formula. So if you Google that, it's some dry reading, unfortunately, but that's how we had to kind of do it. So, and again, what we looked at was the wildlife watching numbers in New York State specifically. So, so I don't know if that helps explain.
It does. So one last thing on funding. If you want to do your part, in my opinion, buy a duck stamp.
Sure.
90% of all those funds go back into wildlife restoration.
Yep.
And they're great gifts.
And John Davis, who was with the Wildlands Network, they've been getting active with the outdoor retail show, which happens twice a year out in Utah, which they're going to change it and change the location now because for a number of reasons. But so John's been out there trying to get active with them, and I've thought about going there and opening up a booth and talking about what happened 17 years ago when this funding proposal was floated for these non-game species. Because you hear a lot of people, wildlife watchers, people who are backpackers and hikers and rock climbers talk about, the inadequate or the discrepancy or how it's all funded from hunters and fishermen, and how can we do our part? And it's kind of closed out. You can't. There doesn't seem to be a mechanism to allow it yet. John and I did propose it to the DEC in New York State in one of those meetings that we had. It went nowhere, unfortunately. We are going to try it in Vermont also. So, Vermont's not generating the kind of wildlife watching revenue that New York State certainly is, but if we can get our foot in the door there as a prototype, maybe we can pitch it other places. So long term, that's what we're doing. And it's remarkable to me, just blows me away that nobody from that side of the aisle has come up with anything in 30 years, complaining for 30 years. The CEO of Black Diamond and the guy that started the North Face, who I'm forgetting his name, who died recently, wrote an editorial in the Salt Lake City Tribune, or the paper there, during the outdoor show, saying, that wolves shouldn't be delisted. What do you guys want to do to help? What can you do to help? So again, we're not seeing folks from that side stepping up to try to figure this out, unfortunately. So. Anybody else?
Did we get a date on the Damerscott thing?
June 28th.
June 28th, 7 p.m.
Pick a name from...
Oh, okay.
Nancy, did you have a question there?
Yeah.
I have a question about habitat. I was looking at your map and you show two areas, one in North Dakota and one in South Dakota, where they are reintroducing the cougars. There's no forest in that area. It is prairie and badlands where there's maybe some little brush down along the rivers and small trees, but don't cougars need a forest-type habitat?
Well, first of all, they weren't reintroduced to those areas. They recolonized from the Rockies, so they took it back on their own. If I didn't clarify that, I apologize. But yeah, they came back there on their own. And the Black Hills has a lot of. It's surrounded by. It's surrounded by.
North Dakota, not in the national grassland.
Right, but there is some forest in there, and there's also rivers and streams, right? What we call riparian habitat, and mule deer live in those rivers and streams because that's where the good grass is. So John Landre, our vice president, has written also a book about prairie mountain lions, and John calls them river cats because they live, where they probably were historically was along those rivers and streams, where the prey base was. So that's where they recolonized. The Black Hills has a lot of other habitat, and plenty of trees certainly, and a lot of deer, and not a lot of competition really. So they were able to recolonize that. There aren't any wolves or bears there, so they had the place to themselves. So that's one of the what we think is one of the densest populations of pumas in North America. So, and the Badlands maybe has about 30 or 40 cats, not a lot of them. And in northwestern Nebraska, there's a national forest called Pine Ridge, about 20 cats there. Not a lot, but just enough to breed and push some east and south. So, yes.
So it might be that same map. There were some purple, very purple areas that in the legend, I thought it said current habitat or current population or something. And there was a big section of Michigan that was purple. So I'm kind of curious what that means, because you have no sightings listed for the southern peninsula of Michigan.
Yeah, haven't been any confirmations in the lower peninsula.
But there have been sightings, but no confirmations. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no physical evidence. No physical evidence in the lower peninsula. There's a book called Bob Butts is the author, and I'm forgetting the title. Who wrote a book about his experience looking for them in Michigan, and he had a sighting, but we have no physical evidence. We have no confirmations of them in the lower peninsula. So
let me ask you another question. So I know some of those people who have seen these cougars in Michigan. And the suggestion was made by somebody, either there, here in Maine, I can't remember, that they don't want confirmation because it's an endangered species, and that would put the brakes on all kinds of economic activity in certain areas.
I do hear that argument, and I don't think it's true. So
you said
I don't think it's true.
You don't think it's true?
I mean, they're not a federally endangered species, although well, we'll see what happens with the eastern cougar, because Michigan was considered part of the eastern cougar's western range. So, Mark McCulloch is finishing up the final comment, or reviewing the final comments from the Eastern Cougar Review, and it's interesting to see what's going to happen. I mean, they're probably not going to list them as endangered, from the west-east. That's not likely to happen, especially if they determine there's one subspecies in North America. Because if you got enough of them out west, they're going to say, well, okay, we don't need them on the East Coast. But I mean, I've heard that argument certainly that if you protect the habitat for them, it's going to curtail development. I don't think that's the case, but I don't think they have to worry about. I mean, they've got conformations in the Upper Peninsula. They are protected in Michigan, so no one can hunt them now, and that's not stopping development as far as I know. So they're not breeding there yet, but yeah. Yes.
What are the politics in the Dakotas that allow these cats to be hunted the way they're being hunted?
The South Dakota game fish and parks did some attitude surveys, public attitude surveys, prior to looking at developing the most recent hunting management plan. And what they found was that among citizens of South Dakota and among residents of South Dakota, they did not want the population to be reduced in the Black Hills. Hunters wanted it reduced, and ranchers wanted it reduced. And they also came up with some studies which suggested that they might be overhunting mule deer and elk. So that was their criteria. And also that they need to keep this population in check to reduce potential conflicts. They don't have many conflicts. And what we have seen during the last 6 or 7 years as they've been hunting them is that some of the conflicts I was talking about, especially with orphaned kittens, when their moms are killed, orphaned kittens go looking for anything to eat, and they show up in people's backyards. So that's some of what happened there.
Do they acknowledge the eastern expansion?
They do, and they're trying to stop it. That's part of that's part of the plan, is to keep dispersal happening, because South Dakota has identified the entire rest of the state as non-suitable habitat for mountain lions. They're not letting the cats determine that. They're determining that based on what they call social reasons.
Just one more question.
Yes.
Are you getting a lot of grassroots support in New England? I know that in the current political climate here in Maine, I would agree with the fellow up front that our state government level, our governor, and I would agree that there's stupid people up in Augusta right now. I don't know how far down the chain that goes. I know that there are a lot of departments here in Maine that are just trying to make do until the regime leaves, so to speak. But are you seeing any kind of grassroots support in Maine or New England for this?
No, very little. And part of what we're up against, again, is that people think they're here. So trying to develop a recovery program or get people interested in reintroductions when a lot of the population already thinks they're here is another tough sell. So, yes?
For the record, is there any research that dictates their population could or would actually get out of control? There's, let's say, so like deer, if they go unchecked, they will go out of control. But for predators, is there a point of getting unchecked? Like, is there founded research for these people to believe that the population will explode if they're not hunted to within, 50% of their population?
No, there are old management ideas about this, okay? But all the research, the new research, first, Washington State University, there's a big carnivore lab there. Bob Wielgus is the primary researcher there. He found out that when you're mountain lion harvest exceeds the reproduction rate, that's when you begin to see problems and more conflicts. So Washington State actually reduced their harvest rate in every single one of their management areas to below that reproduction rate to minimize conflicts, and they reduced their conflicts that way. And we've got 15 years of research from them showing that. We have sent that research to South Dakota and to Nebraska and to North Dakota, so they know. All right. I'm not aware offhand of I mean, certainly you have problem individuals, okay? And what we suggest is that the best way to manage those individuals, unfortunately, is when they get in trouble, okay? But you often have clues. You often have, and say in New Jersey, where you've got all these black bears, there are 3 levels of interventions, depending on what they do. So, you can haze them, you can capture them, you can kill them, depending on what's going on. So if you institute that kind of policy with mountain lions, as they have in California, and they have to do everything they possibly can. If a cat gets marooned in a town or in a residential area, they are required by law to catch that cat and remove him without hurting that cat unless they've been implicated in some kind of conflict or depredation. So they police themselves. All right, they police themselves. We see this especially with, say, coyotes. I mean, you cannot kill coyotes fast enough. I mean, and they'll breed faster and faster the harder you kill them. But every single state on the East Coast just hammers the hell out of them, And if we let them go, they would police themselves, and you wouldn't see so many young individuals out there, which would reduce the number of conflicts. So.